We were enemies. Then the door locked behind us both. I had killed 17 humans before I met one worth keeping alive. That is not a confession. That is a record, clean, documented, filed in the war archives of my people with the same emotional weight as a weather report. War does that to you. It turns death into data. It turns the enemy into a category rather than a creature. I had been fighting humans for 4 years by the time the Battle of Varan City broke everything I thought I understood, and I had been very good at it. I was a commander, youngest in my unit's history. My decisions had saved hundreds of my people and ended hundreds of theirs, and I had made peace with that mathematics the way soldiers always do, by simply not looking at it too closely. Then the Varan City siege collapsed, and I stopped being a commander, and started being a prisoner. It happened fast, the way catastrophic things always do. We had been pushing through the eastern quarter of Varan City for 6 days. My unit of 12 moving through the skeletal remains of what had once been a human civilian center. Towers of broken glass and buckled steel, streets cracked open by bombardment, the air tasting of ash and something electrical that made the back of my throat burn. The humans had been retreating. We were certain of it. Our intelligence said so. Our own eyes said so. Our intelligence was wrong. The ambush came from 3 directions simultaneously, which told me immediately that whoever had planned it understood how my unit moved, our formations, our blind spots, our instinct to split and regroup. Someone had studied us. Someone had been patient. Within 4 minutes, I had lost 8 of my 12. Within 6, I had lost the other 3. I fought alone for another 2 minutes in the rubble of what had been a transit station, and I was good enough that it took 11 of them to finally bring me down, a strike to the back of the head that turned the world white and then black and then nothing. When I woke up, I was underground. The cell was built for humans. I could tell immediately. The proportions were slightly wrong for my frame, the cot too narrow, the ceiling just low enough to feel oppressive in a way designed for a species slightly shorter than mine. The walls were reinforced concrete. The door was solid metal with no visible mechanism on my side, and the single light source was a strip of pale fluorescence bolted high on the wall behind a metal cage. My weapons were gone. My communicator was gone. The armor plates I wore over my shoulders and forearms were gone. I was in my base uniform, dark, close-fitted, practical, and my wrists had been bound with a restraint I didn't recognize. Not my people's technology. Not standard human military issue either. Something third-party. Something new. That was when I understood that neither side had taken me. Something else had. I sat up slowly, taking inventory of my body, bruised ribs, a cut above my left temple that had already clotted, a deep ache in my right shoulder that would need attention but wasn't structural. Functional. I was functional. I filed the pain away and looked around the cell properly. That was when I noticed I wasn't alone. He was on the other side of the cell, as far from me as the space allowed, sitting with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his dark eyes already open and already watching me. He had been awake before I was. He had been sitting in the dark watching me sleep, which meant he had made a tactical assessment and decided that watching was better than acting, which meant he wasn't impulsive. That was the first thing I learned about him. The second thing I learned was that he was injured. His left arm was held at a careful angle, the sleeve of his uniform dark with dried blood from a wound somewhere above the elbow. He wasn't showing the pain. His face was controlled, military flat, but the way he held himself told the story clearly enough to anyone who knew how to read bodies. He was human, male, dark-haired, strong-jawed, with the kind of face that might have been called handsome in another context. In a context that wasn't this one, where we were enemies in a cell neither of us had chosen. He looked at me the way I imagined I looked at him. Assessing, careful, not afraid, which I noted with something that wasn't quite respect but was adjacent to it. "You're the commander," he said, not a question. His voice was low and even. "Zara, 7th Division." I said nothing. "They briefed us on you," he said. "Before Varan City." Something crossed his face briefly. "You hit our eastern flank 3 weeks ago, 12 casualties." 15, I said. The correction was automatic, soldier's habit. His jaw tightened once. Then he exhaled slowly and looked away. Ethan Cole, he said. Captain, 4th Infantry. I had heard the name. His unit had cost my people 8 lives in the Northern Corridor 2 months ago. I did not say this. It seemed unnecessary. How long have you been here? I asked instead. Woke up about an hour before you. He glanced at the door. No contact since. No food, no water, no explanation. The restraints, I said, looking at my wrists. Not your technology. Not yours either, he said. I checked mine when I woke up. I don't recognize the material. We looked at each other across the narrow cell. Outside, somewhere above us, I could hear the distant percussion of bombardment, neither human nor my people's weapons. Something heavier. Something that shook the dust from the ceiling in a slow, steady rain. A third party. We have a common problem, I said. Yeah, said Ethan Cole. He didn't sound happy about it. We do. The enemy bled. I could have let him. He didn't ask for help. That was the first thing I noticed. His arm was bleeding again, slowly, steadily, the dried blood softening and spreading as time passed, and he said absolutely nothing about it. He sat against his wall and I sat against mine, and we listened to the bombardment above us, and neither of us spoke for a long time. He was very good at silence. Most humans I had encountered were not. They filled quiet spaces with noise, with negotiation, with the particular nervous energy of a species that seemed uncomfortable with stillness. Ethan Cole was still. It annoyed me, obscurely. It was easier to maintain clean categories when the enemy behaved like the enemy was supposed to behave. An hour passed. Maybe more. I had no way to measure time accurately without my communicator. The bombardment above us intensified briefly, then settled back into its low, rhythmic thunder. The dust from the ceiling came down in thin curtains. At one point the light flickered, held, flickered again, and stayed on. Your arm, I said finally. He looked at me. It needs pressure, I said. You've been losing blood since before I woke up. At this rate, I stopped. Did the calculation without finishing it aloud. I'm aware, he said. Then why? Because the only way to put pressure on it is to use my other hand, he said, with the careful patience of someone explaining something obvious. And I'd rather keep both hands free. I looked at him for a moment. You think I'm going to attack you? I think you're a trained combatant who has every reason to want me incapacitated, he said. So yes, it was, I had to admit, a logical position. If I wanted you incapacitated, I said, I would have done it while you were watching me sleep and feeling confident about it. Something shifted in his expression. The first crack in the military flatness. A flash of something that might, in other circumstances, have been amusement. Fair point, he said. I crossed the cell. He tracked my movement without flinching, which I respected, and when I crouched beside him and reached for his arm, he went very still but didn't pull away. I pushed the sleeve up carefully. The wound was a deep gash along the outer edge of his upper arm, clean-edged, from something bladed rather than a projectile. It had been bleeding slowly for too long. I need your undershirt, I said. A pause. Then he reached up with his good arm, pulled the outer layer off over his head, then the base layer beneath, and handed it to me without comment. I tore it into strips with efficient movements and bound the wound tightly, working quickly. His skin was warm. Humans ran warmer than my people, something I knew from biology briefings but had never experienced directly. It was strangely disorienting. He smelled of sweat and metal, and something underneath that was simply human in a way I had no reference for. He watched my hands the entire time, not with suspicion anymore, with something more complicated. You've done this before, he said, many times, for your own people. Yes, why do it for me? I tied off the last strip and sat back on my heels and looked at him directly. His eyes were dark brown, I noticed now, not the gray I had assumed in the dim light. Dark brown with something steady and unreachable in them. Because a dead ally is less useful than a living one, I said. And right now, whether we like it or not, you are my ally. He looked at the bandaging on his arm, then at me. Zara, he said. It was the first time he had used my name without it being a tactical identification. It sounded different that way. What are they? The ones who took us? I don't know, I said, but they knew enough about both our forces to neutralize us simultaneously. That takes intelligence gathering on a significant scale. I looked at the ceiling, listening. And whatever they're bombing up there, they're not targeting military positions. The pattern is wrong. Civilian infrastructure, he said quietly. Yes. He was silent for a moment. So while we've been fighting each other, something else has been watching, I said, and waiting. The weight of it settled between us in the small cell. 4 years of war. 4 years of my people and his people tearing through each other with focused, dedicated violence, and somewhere in that shadow, something else had been patient and still and calculating. How do we get out? He asked. The door has a mechanism on the outside only, I said. The restraints are the priority. Once those are off, I can work on the door. But I need something thin and conductive. I looked around the cell. Your tags, I said. Military identification. What are they made of? He reached into the collar of his now-absent undershirt, then stopped, remembering. Looked at the floor where his outer jacket had been discarded when I bandaged him. Reached into the inner pocket and produced a thin metal tag on a chain. He held it out to me. I took it. Our fingers didn't quite touch, but almost. If I get the restraints off, I said, you cover the door. If it opens before I'm done, I know how this works, he said. I know you do, I said. I'm telling you anyway. I began working on the restraint mechanism with the edge of the tag, feeling for the release point by touch. The cell was quiet except for the distant bombardment and the small, precise sounds of metal against metal. Zara, he said after a while. Yes. The 12 casualties, 3 weeks ago, eastern flank. A pause. Were any of them, he stopped. I understood what he was asking. Were any of them unnecessary? Were any of them beyond what the situation required? I kept working. No, I said. They were combatants, armed and positioned. It was a clean engagement. He exhaled slowly. Okay, he said, just that. Okay. I didn't ask him the same question about his 15. I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer, and I wasn't sure that was a feeling I knew how to categorize. The restraint on my left wrist released with a small, sharp click. One down, I said. Above us, the bombardment paused for the first time in hours. In the silence, I could hear Ethan breathing, steady and slow and deliberately calm. I worked faster. We walked out as enemies. We didn't walk back. The second restraint took longer. The release mechanism was slightly different from the first, a deliberate design choice, I realized, meant to slow down exactly this kind of attempt. Whoever had built these had anticipated that their prisoners might be resourceful. That told me something about who we were dealing with. They had done this before. Ethan sat beside me now rather than across from me, close enough that I could work on his restraints immediately after mine. He had moved without being asked when it became clear that proximity was more efficient. Another thing I cataloged about him, he adapted quickly. He didn't let pride interfere with practicality. His restraint released 7 minutes after mine. He flexed his hands once, slowly, and I watched the circulation return to his fingers and said nothing about how long that must have taken to ignore. Door, he said. We moved together to the door. I ran my hands along the seam, feeling for heat signatures, for the particular vibration of an active lock mechanism. Ethan positioned himself to my left and slightly behind, facing the door at an angle that would let him respond to whatever came through it. No discussion required. We simply moved into position the way 2 trained soldiers do when they have a shared objective and enough intelligence to stop wasting time. There's a thermal lock, I said quietly. It needs a biological signal to open from the outside, but the mechanism itself is here. I pressed my palm flat against the door, 3 centimeters left of center. If I can interrupt the circuit. How? I looked at his dog tag, still in my hand. Stand back, I said. I worked the thin edge of the metal into the door seam at precisely the point where the lock circuit ran closest to the surface. It took 4 attempts. On the 5th, I felt the resistance change. A small shudder through the door, a sound like an intake of breath from the mechanism. And then the door swung inward 2 centimeters. Ethan's hand came over my shoulder and pushed it the rest of the way open. We looked at each other once, fast and complete and without words. Then we went through. The corridor beyond was dark and empty and smelled of burned circuitry. We moved quickly and quietly, Ethan taking the left side, me the right, leapfrogging coverage points the way neither of us had been trained to do with the other, but both of us understood instinctively. The corridor branched twice. I went by sound, following the bombardment, which had resumed above us, reasoning that the structural damage would be greatest where the attacks were concentrated, which meant exits. We found 3 of their soldiers on the second branch. They were not human. They were not my people. They were something I had seen only in intelligence briefings, tall, angular, with the particular stillness of a species that had evolved as ambush predators. They moved without sound. In the dark corridor, they were almost invisible. Ethan saw them half a second after I did. What happened next lasted approximately 90 seconds, and I will not describe it in detail, except to say that we were, both of us, very good at what we had been trained to do, and that Ethan Cole fought with the same economy and precision I used myself, and that at the end of those 90 seconds we were both still standing and they were not. We stood in the corridor breathing hard and looked at each other. His face was unreadable. Mine, I suspected, was the same. "Exit," I said. "Exit," he agreed. We came up through a collapsed service entrance into what had been a city square. Varan City was unrecognizable. 4 years of war had taken its towers and its streets and its particular human architecture and replaced them with something that looked like the surface of a dead planet. Rubble fields stretching in every direction. The skeleton of a great bridge visible against the sky to the north. Fires burning in the middle distance with the slow patience of fires that have been burning for days. The sky above was the color of a bruise, lit from beneath by destruction. We stood in the open air for a moment and simply breathed it. Then Ethan said, "My command post was in the northern sector, before the siege collapsed." He looked at me. "If it's still standing." "My unit's emergency frequency," I said. "If any of them survived, they'll be listening." I paused. "The northern sector is also where the bombardment is lightest." We looked at each other. "Together," he said. Not a question, a position. "Together," I said. We walked for 2 hours through the ruins of Varan City. We didn't talk much. There was a particular quality to the silence between us now that was different from the hostile quiet of the cell. It was the silence of 2 people who have stopped spending energy on managing each other and can simply move. We communicated in gestures and glances, and the small, precise signals of soldiers who have learned to trust each other's instincts, even when they haven't yet learned to trust each other's intentions. At some point, crossing a field of rubble that had been a residential block, I slipped on a piece of unstable debris. His hand caught my arm before I registered that I was falling. He released it the moment I had my footing, without comment, without making it into anything. I found that I was thinking about his hands, their particular steadiness, the way they had gone still and open when I bandaged his arm, trusting me with something vulnerable without making a performance of the trust. I stopped thinking about his hands and focused on the terrain. The command post was standing. Barely, one wall had partially collapsed, and the communications array was running on emergency power, but standing. And inside it, 3 of his people and, by a chance that felt almost too large to process, 2 of mine, who had been sheltering there for 6 hours after being cut off from the rest of the unit. The moment was complicated. His soldiers raised weapons. Mine raised weapons. Ethan and I stood between them in the doorway of a half-collapsed building in the ruins of Varan City and looked at each other, and something passed between us that I still don't entirely have language for, a recognition, perhaps. A shared understanding of exactly how absurd and exactly how necessary the next moment was. "Stand down," said Ethan, quietly, absolutely. His people lowered their weapons. Slowly, with confusion written clearly on their faces, but they lowered them. I looked at my 2. "Stand down," I said in our language. They did. In the silence that followed, Ethan looked at me. "Someone needs to make a call," he said. "To both commands, at the same time." "Yes," I said, "if we tell them what's out there." "They'll have to listen," I said. "They won't want to, but they'll have to." He nodded slowly. Then he did something I didn't expect. He held out his hand, open, palm up, the human gesture I had studied in briefings as an indicator of non-aggression, of offered alliance. I looked at it for a moment. Then I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, warm, steady, certain. And I felt something shift in the architecture of everything I had believed about what this war was, and what it was for, and who the enemy actually was. "Zara," he said. "Ethan," I said. We held the channel open to both commands simultaneously, and we spoke. And it took a long time, and it was not easy, and there were voices on both ends that did not want to hear what we were saying. But we kept talking. We held the line together, our hands still joined in the space between us, and we talked until the voices stopped arguing and started listening. The ceasefire was announced 6 hours later. It was fragile and imperfect and full of conditions that would take years to negotiate properly. It was the beginning of something rather than the end of anything, but it held. Outside the half-collapsed command post, in the ruined square of Varan City, the bombardment had finally stopped. The silence it left behind was enormous and unfamiliar, and slowly, something that might become peace. Ethan stood beside me in the doorway, looking out at it. "What happens now?" he said quietly. I looked at the bruised sky, lightening at its eastern edge. At the fires burning lower. At the broken city that two peoples had spent 4 years destroying and would now, perhaps, begin the longer and harder work of understanding. "Now," I said, "we find out who we are when we're not at war." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me, fully, the way he had looked at me in the cell when the categories had first begun to fail, when I had stopped being the enemy and started being something his training had no name for. "I'd like to find that out," he said, "with you." I looked back at him. At the scar on his jaw I hadn't noticed until the light improved. At the steadiness in his dark eyes that had not wavered once, not in the cell, not in the corridor,